The Russian Orthodox Church has been in North America since 1794, as an official canonical mission, then as a diocese. By 1872, the bishop's see was San Francisco, and the services, preaching, and teaching were already partly in English. This was largely due to the vision and influence of St. Innocent, the first bishop in North America, and later Metropolitan of Moscow, who continued to guide and advise the mission in America. He laid the foundations on which many others have built. The Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, ROCOR, as a distinct organization, formed as a result of the isolation of the external dioceses of the Russian Church from Moscow and the Patriarchate due to the Bolshevik coup and subsequent civil war. However, from the beginning, the American diocese was a constitutive core element of the ROCOR Synod of Bishops. Some see ROCOR as a unique community of exiles who took refuge in America and brought their church with them, which is true to an extent. However, it is only part of the story. The Russian Church had been here for well over 100 years when the Russian Revolution happened. Like the newest wave of exiles, they looked to the Synod of Bishops as the supreme church authority cut off from the Patriarch by the Communists. It is a shared history. From an American perspective, the arrival of the Russian exiles was basically one more wave of immigration that was incorporated into the Russian Church in America. This is a story with endless amounts of intrigues and betrayals, schism and separation, but it is also a story of how the Church adapted to integrate multiple communities with different histories in order to forge a united Orthodox community in communion, overcoming the intrigues, schisms, and separations. The greatest challenge will be to integrate the whole history of all the Orthodox communities in America so that we can move towards a fully united church in America, respecting the diversity of histories, culture, and language, but also striving for unity on all levels. St. Innocent was one of the greatest Christian missionaries of all time. He evangelized native peoples, learned their languages, translated sacred texts of both Scripture and the liturgies, established churches, and formed clergy. He manifested the gospel through his words, works, and activity. St. Innocent helped to lay the foundations of orthodoxy in North America, particularly in Alaska, by his personal outreach and activity, and then later in Siberia. In the third phase of his ministry as Metropolitan of Moscow, he founded and developed the Russian Missionary Society, which funded mission work in Alaska and the rest of North America until the Russian Revolution. One of the most important aspects of his work was to disciple, train, and send out clergy, especially native clergy, who largely carried out the spread of mission throughout Alaska. He established a seminary. He formed and equipped men to take up his work. One of the greatest examples is St. Yakov Netzvedov, the first Native American priest, the evangelizer of the Aleuts, Yupik Eskimo, Athabaskan, and Tlingit peoples. These missions had little to do with the expansion of the Russian Empire. Rather, they were precisely centered on spreading the gospel, calling people to repentance and baptism, and to establish the church. In 1823, St. Innocent first went as a missionary with his wife, mother-in-law, and children to a remote island in the far west of the Aleutian chain. He built a house and a church and began to learn the language. He used this as a base to missionize the Aleuts. He not only learned the language, but created an alphabet and written language and translated texts. He wrote in Aleut an indication of the way to the kingdom of heaven. From this base he traveled widely, often in a kayak or bidarka, by himself in the Bering Sea, visiting communities, teaching, preaching, baptizing, and serving liturgy. Visiting Russia to make a report, he learned of the death of his wife and was tonsured a monk and consecrated a bishop. The first bishop consecrated for Alaska, Yosef, in 1799, drowned when his ship went down just off Kodiak, never having set foot in Alaska as its bishop. St. Innocent established the canonical foundation of the diocese in America that would grow into the Russian Orthodox mission. In his journeys, St. Innocent visited the Russian colony in California, Fort Ross, and then proceeded to visit the Spanish missions in the San Francisco Bay Area. He was able to converse with the Franciscan friars in fluent Latin. This was the first positive contact between the Russian and Spanish clergy. In 1815, the Spanish had seized a Russian ship off the coast of Central California. While customary courtesies were exchanged with the officers, the Spanish tried to force a young seal hunter in the employ of the Russians to receive Roman Catholic baptism. He refused, saying he was already an Orthodox Christian, and was brutally tortured and murdered. We venerate his memory as St. Peter the Aleut. St. Innocent's encounter with the friars is memorialized in the old Spanish mission in the town of Sonoma, with a painting of a Russian priest monk or bishop facing off with a Roman Catholic Franciscan friar. The Russian river valley was the meeting point between the two empires. Russian colonial activity declined rapidly from the 1840s. In Alaska, few Russian missionaries came to serve the native peoples, and the mission was almost entirely taken over by native Alaskans. In California, the Russians mingled with the Spanish, and Fort Ross and its properties were sold. In the 1850s, St. Innocent was called to focus on the missionary work in Siberia. One winter, however, he was stuck in Petropavlovsk, Kamchatka, along with the new young chaplain, Father Nikolai Kasatkin, who was on his way to serve at the Russian embassy in Tokyo. St. Innocent inspired the young hieromonk to missionary effort, who then followed his teachings and went on to establish the Orthodox Church in Japan. The Japanese mission followed the same basic plan as St. Innocent had worked out in Alaska. St. Nikolai learned the language and translated the sacred texts, preached, taught, discipled, and baptized, and trained native Japanese as clergy and catechists to do the work of evangelization and mission. St. Innocent's missionary philosophy was to turn the mission over to the locals as soon as possible. The church has to be local, the local language, culture, and people. This is an essential element of Orthodox ecclesiology. Orthodox Christians have as our homeland the kingdom of heaven, and we have no earthly country. We are at home nowhere and everywhere in this world. We must communicate the gospel in a language people can understand. This means adopting and adapting cultural forms as well as concepts to convey the message. Much of the work of the missionary is to form and disciple men, mostly men, to take up the work of mission. The Russian Church in the 18th century confronted Islam, Lamaistic Buddhism, and various shamanic religions, and brought great numbers of people to Christ in the Orthodox Church throughout Asia. The Theological Academy in Kazan specialized in missions and taught classes in all these religions and dozens of languages. In the last half of the 19th century, missionary efforts were supported by the Mission Society and guided by St. Innocent. These missions were not outposts of Russian ethnic culture, but rather local Orthodox churches. By the end of the 19th century, the liturgy was being served in 120 languages just within the Russian Empire. It is important to note that there were no ethnic, racial, or cultural barriers in these missions. They reflected the Catholicity of the Church. This Catholicity, universality, wholeness, fullness of the Church means that there is a place within the Church for everyone of every language, race, and color. Catholicity is essential to the orthodoxy of the Church. The great challenge is to discern how to make that universal embrace a reality and bring people to faith in Jesus Christ as Orthodox Christians. It means that we strive to transcend all the factors that try to limit the mission and work of the Church to specific people, places, and countries. St. John of San Francisco is remembered to have said that the reason for the dispersion of the Russian peoples, the exiles, was precisely to spread orthodoxy throughout the world. He was not talking about creating little pockets of Russian culture, exiles and expatriates, that would inevitably die out within a couple of generations. Rather, he espoused a missionary vision that wherever Orthodox people go, they establish churches and bring local people to the church, to Christ and orthodoxy. This has certainly been the case in America. The legacy of St. Innocent as a missionary and the first bishop in North America was a diocesan structure with a missionary dynamic, at first focused on Alaska, but later becoming the canonical foundation for the expansion of the Russian mission, first to California, then across the continent. Many parishes were organized by the many groups of immigrants, most of which began under the canonical umbrella of the Diocese of Alaska, then of San Francisco. There were other groups and parishes in America, but no bishops or canonical structures until the 1920s. By the end of the 19th century, with St. Tikhon as bishop in San Francisco, parishes stretched across the continent. In the early days, the clergy were often Russians, but the parishioners were usually Greeks or Serbs and some Syrians. There were few ethnically homogeneous parishes in America. Alaska became its own diocese with a primarily native population. Many church buildings and the salaries of clergy were funded by the Missionary Society. Starting in 1888, thousands of Carpatho-Rusin immigrants from the Austro-Hungarian Empire returned to Orthodoxy from the Unia and entered the mission. Huge waves of immigration began to flood the U.S. throughout the next decades, and the Orthodox had to be ministered to. A seminary was established along with pastoral schools and St. Tikhon's Monastery in Pennsylvania. St. Tikhon came to San Francisco in 1897. He not only oversaw the multiplication of parishes, but he saw the need for a multi-ethnic episcopate to minister to the various groups in their own languages. He consecrated non-Russian bishops, such as St. Raphael Hawawini for the Syrians. He blessed St. Sebastian Dabovich, a native son of the San Francisco Cathedral, to gather the Serbian communities. His vision, solidly in line with that of St. Innocent, was for a united, multi-ethnic, multilingual church in North America under the Russian Orthodox Church. St. Innocent had envisioned the American church serving, preaching, and teaching in English, and bringing American converts into Orthodoxy. So also St. Tikhon put this firmly into practice, authorizing translations into English for liturgical use. By the time of the Bolshevik coup in 1917, there were about 300 parishes in the U.S., 2 seminaries, a monastery, orphanage, and pastoral schools. There were 4 bishops and several missions to the Serbs, Americans, Syrians, and Albanians. There were other parishes, mostly Greek, but no canonical structure. All this would change in a few years. In 1917, with the abdication of Tsar Nicholas II, the Great Council of the Russian Church, and the Bolshevik coup, church life was thrown into chaos. Many American church leaders were in Moscow for the council. The murder of clergy, martyrdom, began soon after the Bolsheviks seized power. Communication and travel became very difficult, especially as the coup turned into a civil war. Tikhon had been elected patriarch, but the great body of the council's decisions could not be fully enacted, and the patriarchate went into survival mode. Trying to resist the murderous attacks of the communists, and soon of the living church schismatics who were tools of the regime. In 1920, Patriarch Tikhon issued a ukaz ordering external dioceses to create structures that would act as supreme church authorities until normal relations could be restored. This occurred first in Stavropol for southeast Russia, then Simferopol under Metropolitan Anthony Kropovitsky. It formed the basis for the church abroad. Soon, however, as the tides of the Civil War turned against the White Army, many thousands of people fled Russia, including clergy and bishops. On November 1st, 1920, a group of Russian bishops in Sremski Karlovci, Serbia, formed the highest Russian church administration abroad. This consisted of Metropolitan Anthony Krapovitsky as the senior hierarch, Metropolitan Platon, Archbishops Anastasi and Theophan, and Bishop Benjamin. They tried to bring the dispersed exiles to unity. They sent out letters, however, calling for the restoration of the monarchy and the Romanov dynasty. This not only proved controversial, but it invoked the wrath of the Bolsheviks. The council gained great acceptance among the Russians outside the Soviet Union. In the West, both Evlogi in Europe and Anthony of Alaska, on behalf of the North American diocese, recognized the authority of the council, as well as did other churches. In 1922, 2 ukazes were sent allegedly by Patriarch Tikhon, condemning the council for having engaged in politics. This was rejected as having been written under obvious Bolshevik pressure. A sobor was held, and the higher church administration was replaced with the Synod of Bishops. Most of the exiles had submitted to the authority of this synod. They continued to recognize Patriarch Tikhon and his successors, Peter and Sergius, until 1926. In 1927, Metropolitan Sergius, acting as locum tenens, wrote that he recognized the legal legitimacy of the Soviet regime and demanded that all clergy submit loyalty oaths to the Soviet regime. This, of course, was refused by the clergy outside of Russia. Those in Russia who refused were bitterly persecuted. One who did capitulate, however, was Evlogi of Western Europe, who ended up submitting himself and his diocese to the Ecumenical Patriarchate. In America, Metropolitan Platon was appointed as head of the church by the Synod of Bishops in 1922, and was acknowledged as such by Patriarch Tikhon, but with no documentation. In 1923, Platon composed a false ukaz allegedly from Patriarch Tikhon, appointing him as head of the American Church. When this came to civil litigation over a property dispute with the Living Church schismatics, his forgery was revealed. In 1924, Platon received an ukaz from Patriarch Tikhon dismissing him for anti-Soviet and counter-revolutionary activities. In response, Platon convinced an all-American council in Detroit, which proclaimed the American Church temporarily autonomous until a new Russian council could be convened. This was more a grasping towards autocephaly than autonomy. There was a great controversy and alienation, with Platon asserting that the Synod abroad was uncanonical. In 1927, the Synod suspended Platon and appointed Apollinary as head of the American Church. Thus, those who followed Platon, much of the American diocese, were in schism. In 1929, this group became known as the Metropolia. In 1933, Archbishop Benjamin came to America to try to reconcile the American Metropolia to Moscow, again demanding loyalty oaths to the Soviet government. He declared the status of the American diocese to be null and void, and that Platon and his followers were schismatics. Platon died in 1934, and the Fifth All-American Sobor elected Theophilus as Metropolitan. Moscow immediately suspended him. The Synod abroad hoped for reconciliation and sent Archimandrite Vitaly from Pachayev to try to bring peace. Thanks to the intervention of Patriarch Varnava of Serbia in 1935, unity was reestablished both with the American Theophilus and West European Evlogi. The American Metropolia accepted to be part of the Russian Church abroad again, affirming it at the Bishop's Sobor in Pittsburgh and at the All-American Sobor in New York, 1937. This lasted through the war years until 1946. When Stalin gave the Church relative freedom, the American Metropolia tried again to return to the Mother Church. This political wrangling soured relations with both Moscow and the Synod, and resulted in the canonical isolation of the Metropolia, being regarded by both as schismatic. This would last until 1970. At the heart of the issue was that the 1946 Sabor allowed the decision to be made by the whole assembly, bishops, clergy, and laity, without enactment by the Bishops' Council. This ended in a civil lawsuit, with the judicial conclusion that the Synod Abroad was the supreme judicial tribunal for the Church in America. It rejected as uncanonical the rule of a general council, including lower clergy and laity, as the supreme authority, but rather only a bishop's council could make such a binding decision. During the war, the Synod remained centered in Europe. A new cathedral was built in Berlin. Synod priests participated in the Pskov mission, following the German troops into occupied Soviet territory and reopening churches. In 1950, the Synod Abroad relocated to New York, strengthening the small flock it had left in America. The 1946 schism of the Metropolia hardened the separation between these communities. While there was communication, there was no communion, nor was there any relationship with the Moscow Patriarchate. Throughout the Orthodox communities in America, there were splits over politics, those remaining faithful to their mother churches, and those refusing communion with churches under communist influence. The split in the Russian community was mirrored in the Serbian, Bulgarian, and Romanian churches. In addition, there were the old calendarist groups, especially the Greeks. By the 1950s, there were at least 15 Orthodox jurisdictions in North America. The Russian exiles in the Synod Abroad built new lives in America. Many churches were built, community organizations formed, and the churches became centers to nurture and preserve pre-revolutionary Russian culture. ROCOR was in full relationship and communion with most of the churches in America except the Metropolia and Moscow parishes. The Synod Abroad also had to oversee its dioceses in Western Europe, Australia and New Zealand, South America, and Indonesia. It remained staunchly traditional and fiercely anti-communist. Starting in the 1960s, the Metropolia began contacts with the Moscow Patriarchate through the World Council of Churches and Metropolitan Nicodim. These talks continued throughout the 60s and in 1970 culminated in the Metropolia receiving autocephaly from the Moscow Patriarchate. On one hand, it restored the Metropolia to communion and thus to some canonical status. On the other, it gave complete independence. One underlying motivation for this was to provide a canonical foundation for Orthodox unity in America, with the presumptions that all the other jurisdictions could come together in the autocephaly as a united church. This, however, did not occur. The Orthodox Church in America, or OCA, constituted less than 20% of the Orthodox community in America. The other jurisdictions were not interested in changing the status quo, either in relation to their mother churches or in America, but particularly they had no desire to submit to the OCA Synod for political, economic, or personal reasons. The Greeks immediately condemned it as uncanonical, both in terms of Moscow's right to grant autocephaly, and they claimed the primacy of jurisdiction in the so-called diaspora. ROCOR viewed it as a capitulation to the communist-controlled patriarchate, and it only enforced their disregard for the Metropolia as schismatic. During this same era, there was a growing presence of traditionalist Greeks that found ROCOR a refuge for their old calendarist ideology. ROCOR received Holy Transfiguration Monastery in Brooklyn, Massachusetts. The monastery had a very strong sectarian influence on the ideology of ROCOR, which resulted in a general condemnation of new calendarists, which was most of the Orthodox in America and the Greek world, ecumenists and modernists. This led to strained relations and condemnation of other Orthodox, and led to a partial canonical isolation of ROCOR, which had never existed earlier. In the late 1960s, a new monastery in Northern California formed in the little town of Platina. This monastery of St. Herman of Alaska produced one of the most influential Orthodox writers of the 20th century, Hieromonk Seraphim Rose. Father Seraphim, then Eugene Rose, had done graduate studies in ancient Chinese language, culture, and religion. He converted to Orthodoxy under the influence of St. John of Shanghai and San Francisco, and learned from him. He and a seminarian friend, Gleb Podmashensky, who later became Father Herman, with whom he founded an Orthodox brotherhood with a bookstore and publishing operation in San Francisco, which later took the form of a skeet in the mountains near Platina. They strongly advocated the canonization of St. Herman of Alaska, which was done simultaneously with the Metropolia in 1970. They strongly promoted the missionary vision of Orthodoxy to Americans, built on the foundations established by St. Herman, St. Innocent, and St. Tikhon. They fought against the sectarian mindset of the Greeks and Transfiguration Monastery. Father Seraphim was a remarkable man, a self-educated theologian, and a very creative writer. His works have inspired thousands, circulating in translations into many different languages and countries, and especially in Russia. He conveyed the reality of orthodoxy to people thirsting for God and the integrity of spiritual life. He showed that it was possible for Americans to convert to orthodoxy and preserve their own cultural identity. Indeed, the Platina Monastery began a movement, albeit small, of conversion to orthodoxy in ROCOR and the establishment of English-language parishes. This served an essential purpose, to get ROCOR back in touch with its roots in the original Russian mission, and to show that it is the spiritual heir of the legacy of the Vallam monks of the Kodiak mission of 1794, St. Innocent and St. Tikhon. His effect on Russia was very profound, and many were attracted to the church after reading his books. It is interesting that Father Seraphim Rose is far better known in Russia and Eastern Europe than he is in America. In the last decades of the 20th century, ROCOR became isolated in America by the Zealots, who exercised undue influence on Metropolitans Filaret and Vitali. This ideology was in line with the Greek Old Calendarist movement and combined with anti-ecumenist and anti-communist sentiment with staunch traditionalism. It would lead to schisms from ROCOR, especially in relation to consideration of reconciliation with Moscow. Metropolitan Loris was the first metropolitan to seriously consider reconciliation with Moscow, starting in the year 2000. It had already been 9 years since the collapse of Soviet power. Of primary concern were governmental influence on the Russian Church and the necessity for the Church to address the slaying of Tsar Nicholas II and the royal family, the persecution of the Church, and the many thousands who had given their lives for Christ. These issues were addressed by the Jubilee Council in 2000 with the canonization of the new martyrs and the various documents on church life and discipline that came from that council. Correspondence and meetings began. The hierarchs, clergy, and faithful of ROCOR began to visit Russia and to see the reality of church life there. President Vladimir Putin met with Metropolitan Loris in 2003, urging reconciliation. Despite an internal schism of zealots from ROCOR who rejected the reconciliations, the discussions progressed. Finally, in 2006, in Sabor, ROCOR voted to proceed. The Act of Canonical Communion was signed on May 17, 2007. ROCOR became an autonomous archdiocese within the Moscow Patriarchate, preserving its own life and working with the Patriarchate and its bishops, and with its bishops participating in synods. Thus, the long period of separation between Moscow and ROCOR was brought to a close. In 2010, ROCOR also reconciled with the OCA, healing the schism that had persisted since 1946. Today, ROCOR has 594 parishes worldwide and 51 monasteries in 43 countries, 225 parishes in the US and Canada, 67 in Australia and New Zealand, 48 in Germany, and 22 in Indonesia. It has a growing Western Rite outreach with some 60 communities. The Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia is the heir of the long missionary tradition that established Orthodoxy in America, the tradition and legacy of St. Herman of Alaska, St. Innocent and St. Tikhon, and the many other holy men and women that struggled to ground the Church in this country. It has the responsibility to reach out, to go forth, teach, baptize, and disciple all the nations that it encounters, and to minister to those who come to it. There are two main missions that ROCOR targets in America: the new Russian immigrants, now in the fourth wave, and the Americans who come looking for the Orthodox faith. One mission necessitates the Russian language, the other English. Of course, we also need to add Spanish and French. Both are missionary tasks and require much of the same kind of work. Both are to populations that have been devastated by secular humanism and materialism and have suffered from the depersonalization of socialism. Within the Orthodox community, ROCOR remains the most traditional of the jurisdictions and provides the possibility not only of old world piety, but of a deeply spiritual ascetic worldview. It rejects the secularization of the Church and of Orthodoxy. If we can remember St. Innocent and his vision for mission, and for the mission in America, we will fulfill his legacy. That mission is nothing other than the vision that our Lord Jesus Christ laid out for his disciples. Go into all the world and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you, and thus he will be with us even to the end of the world.